Today we're going to talk about eye splicing. Now, eye splicing is where you put a permanent eye on the end of a line. Now, I've watched dozens of videos on doing eye splicing, and admittedly I am not an expert at making eye splices. I have, however, been successful at making quite a few eye splices. In many of those videos they are experts in eye splicing, and the problem is they tend to forget what a beginner doesn't already know. And secondly, they tend to demonstrate on very large diameter lines, and the larger the diameter, the easier it is to splice. Hence, they have a very successful demonstration. Now, what I've learned is that there are two classes of line. First is a class 1, and the second is a class 2. Now, that's the first thing you need to know before you start attempting an eye splice, is which class your line is in. So basically, a class 1 is where the core and the cover are the equal number of braids and that they both share the load 50-50. In a class 2, it's just the core that does all of the hard work. So hence, there are two different ways that you need to make an eye splice. One of the things they don't tell you is what type of line they're working on. Now, polyester is a very tightly woven line, and typically that is the type of line we're using for halyards and main sheets. And unless you have a gigantic boat, you're probably using very small diameter line. So the line that I need for Skylark is a 5/16, and what I'm using is a Sta-set line, which is polyester, and it is a class 1 line. So there's a couple of little tricks and tips that I want to share that I've learned along the way. So we'll get started making an eye splice in our Sta-set line. Now, before we get started, I want to talk a little about the tools that you need. So basically we need some awls, and I have 3 different awls here to work with. Need a pen to mark with, some tape, a pair of scissors, and a nice sharp knife. Now, the other thing that you need are fids. Now, I bought my fids from Samson, and this is this eye splicing kit, and it came with several fids and a pusher of different sizes. Now, one of the things you need to know about fids is their diameter needs to be the same as the diameter of the line. Now, fortunately, that they're usually written right on there. For example, this is 5/16 line, and on here it has 5/16. So this is the fid that I'm going to need for this line. Now, one of the first tips that I want to share is that when I got the fids, for example, on this one that I haven't done anything to yet, so if I rub my finger across the writing here, I can feel that it is raised up. And one of the things that the fid needs to do is it needs to slide in the rope very easily. So what I did, and you can see the difference here between the 5/16 fid that I've used and this fid, is that I have sanded it down so it's, in fact, I can't feel the writing on there at all. And then I took it down to 1,000 grit sandpaper and polished it. So and then I actually put a little Renaissance wax on there also. So that's one of the first tips, is that makes it much easier to slide that fid into the line. So the other thing I would suggest is printing out some instructions. Now, I have some instructions here from it's actually from the Samson website, and I will leave a link to this PDF in the description of the video. It's much helpful to have written directions so that when you're watching a video, you're not starting and stopping and trying to back up and forward. So having some written instructions is quite helpful in addition to the video. So we'll get started now making our eye splice. So the first thing we're going to do is to determine the size of the eye that we're going to make. So to do that, we start with a fid length on the end of the line, and we make a mark. And then this is my gaff boom, and so what I'm doing is making a gaff bridle. So So what we want to do is to put this around. So that's the diameter that I want it to slide around like that. So now we make a second mark. So now we have our two starting points of point A and point B. So the next thing we want to do is we want to go from point B over about 5 fiddlings. Now, if you need to, you can put a stopper knot in here like so, or a stop loop like that. I am just going to simply put it in my vise to hold it, since I have it right here on the end of my table. So our next step is we want to extract the core here at point B. So the best way to do that is first to take the tape off of the end. And it's a good idea to kind of pull the core back at least to where point B point B is. That kind of loosens the fibers in there, and do that a couple of times. So with it a little bit loose, I'm going to try to start opening up the cover here. While it's looser, it's a little easier to get in there. And in some cases, you might need to use 2-awls to sort of work on that cover and get that core out of there. What I'm doing is I'm making sure that I'm not going through the core with my awl. I want to get down underneath it, so I'm not catching any of the cover, just the core. Get that worked up out of there. Okay, so once we've got that started, then we can pull the core all the way out. Now, because I sort of loosened that core up, I want to kind of pull it back so that it's at the beginning. You kind of can check this so that it's close to the end, then you know that you've got it back. And at this point, we want to make a mark. This mark will be mark number 1. And mark it all the way around. We now want to extract the core some more and take our fid, and on the fid there are some little marks here which indicate a short section. So we want to go over a short section and we want to make 2 marks there. So I'm going to do that all the way around the core. And then from that, we want to go over a fid plus a short section. And here we want to make it 3 marks. We now want to begin tapering the cover. So if we look here at point A, what we want to do is we want to taper this section. Now, in some cases, the other instructions have said to go over a little bit to start. And what I've learned is if you start the taper at this point, all of that will pull into the cover much easier. So from this point, then what we need to do is to count every 6th strand. So if I go top here and I start and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and mark that one, and then mark the other strand next to it. And then the same thing again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and mark it, and then mark the other one, and we'll do this all the way to the end. So that puts us to the end, so we're okay. So now we're ready to start pulling out some of the strands. Now this is a point where some of the experienced eye splicers will simply take the end of the rope and fray it, and then they'll take their scissors and cut on a diagonal off of there. Now what I found is then you end up with all these little loose ends sticking out, which are quite hard to manage getting in there. So I prefer doing it this way. It takes a little longer, and obviously those that are much more experienced have learned little shortcuts, and that would be a shortcut. So what I want to do now is to take each of these strands that I've marked, just use the tip of my scissors here to grab a hold of it and pull that out. Oops, I don't want to cut it yet. And pull those strands out, and then do the same thing with the left-hand weave here. Pull that out, and then snip these off. One of my favorite tools for doing this type of work are these little thread snips that I have here. They're really handy. You can operate with the scissors in your hands, and they just really are very nice to nip off those little pieces like that. This particular pair are made in Italy. They're really not all that expensive. I think this pair was maybe about $15 or so. They're extremely sharp, and in doing this type of work, it's really, really handy to both use that tip to get those threads started. And then you can see, just nip that right off. So instead of picking up a tool and so forth in order to do this, these little, they call them thread nippers or thread snips. They were also really handy when I was making the sails, of basically being able to sew and push the fabric through and keep them in my hand and then snip little pieces of thread off. So I would highly recommend getting a pair of these because they're extremely handy for lots of operations like cutting tape or whatever that you're going to do where you have something that you would like to not pick up and put down and pick up and put down and switch tools. And the last one. One more. Now remember, this is our point A right here. Okay, now you can see that that makes a very nice taper on there. Now, this, from this point out, is all going to be tucked back into the cover. So our next step now is we're going to tuck the cover inside of the core. So I want to pull the core out till I get to where my point 3 is, and can get rid of this little marker in there. And what we want to do is to get our fid, and I want to put a little piece of tape on the end of here. I want to try to get it as tight as possible. And what I like to do is then cut this off so I have a nice square edge on my end. we now want to tuck into the back of our fid. And then we want to put another piece of tape around the fid and the cover to hold it in there. We're now going to start placing that tapered cover into the core. So starting at mark 2, I put the fid in and we slowly put that through the core, being very careful not to catch any of the fibers, so we stay right in the center of that. And once we get down to mark 3, we then want to have our fid exit the core. Once it's exited the core, we can then pull the fid and the tapered cover through the core. After cutting off the taped end, we can now get that tapered cover to go inside of the core. So the first thing that I want to do is to make sure that point A and mark 2 are lined up with each other. And at that spot, I put an awl in there just to hold it temporarily. And now I can take the core and start milking it over the top of that tapered cover. So the next step, which I find to be one of the more difficult ones, is burying the core. So we'll put the core back into here and into this part a little bit. Now the desired amount would be a short fid length. So if we stretch out the cover, that puts us about right there. And I'm going to make just a tiny little mark so I know where to come out at. So what I need to do is I need to feed the core through there. So I'm going to do that is to take a little piece of tape, put it around, and I'm going to cut quite a bit of this off so I can come in a little ways where the core is still pretty tight and put a piece of tape to secure that around there. Getting the core into the fid sometimes can be a little bit of a challenge. So if you cut it on diagonal like this a little bit, then it is much easier to slip it into the back of that fid. Tape straight. Like that. And then you can take a piece of tape and tape that on there. Okay, now we want to start down here at, we've been point A, and start moving into the core, or into cover, I should say. And again, we want to be careful that we don't snag any little pieces. And when I get here, I want to kind of milk the cover up a little bit so that it's got some space here for the fid to go into. And then this is where it is a little tricky with this polyester. Once we get to the spot there, it kind of helps to kind of separate some cords here so that the fid has a hole to come out of. Now, one of the things I'm doing is I'm bunching the cover up, because when it pulls it out, it acts like a, when I was a kid, they used to have these Chinese handcuffs. You put your fingers in, you couldn't get them out. It's essentially what this cover does. So you can see this is where that waxing and having that fid polished really help. There we go. Got it out. And what I do is to pull that core the rest of the way through there. Now here at this, what they call the transition point, we want to make sure that everything is kind of nice and loose and fits in there well. Now we can start pushing the core into the thing. And this is where it's very important that it be tied down to something tight there, and also that you start to milk the cover back. Before we do that, we can take our fid off. Now what we're going to do is to grab a hold of it, and we're going to, you can see where the cover is pretty loose here. So we're going to basically milk this cover and pull it back and get this core and cover to go up into the cover here. So we just basically want to pull on it, bring it down and milk it. Now, one of the things I can do, if you have trouble keeping it milked up there, is you can use this cord, and you can, let's see if I get this on here, basically tie a little stopper cord on here with a little hitch like this. And you can use that then to tighten down here and then pull on that, and that'll milk that down and keep it there. So now we want to just kind of pull that. In this case, sometimes it's handy to take a steel rod or something like that and then pull on it. We basically have our splice in there. Now what we're going to do is to bury the core here. Now I'm going to do that is I'm going to make a mark here where it's coming out, and then I want to extract it a little bit. Like so. Then I want to cut it short of that. And then at this point, I want to taper it a little bit. So I'm just going to kind of open these up and start cutting them off a few at a time here. And now we just need to pull the cover and get that tucked back in there. So there's our completed eye. Now then we want to put, to finish the splice, we want to put some whipping on here. And then we wind that around here, making it nice and tight. I'll put this, tuck this underneath that loop. And then pull on this one, and that should extract that down inside the winding. And then clean those tails off. And we have it. There's our complete eye splice. Now here's the finished eye on the gaffed boom. Now you can see that I also added one on the other end of the line to make the gaff bridle. Now in some cases you may want to add a thimble or a shackle to the line. Now in this case I added a thimble on this peak halyard line because of the wear and tear that may occur here at the line. That thimble will help protect it. When you're adding a thimble, it's important that you put the thimble in before you pull the eye completely tight. Now in the case of this jib halyard, you can see that I have a snap shackle on here in addition to a thimble. So the important thing here is that whenever you have a closed loop, that you insert the thimble and the shackle before you put the cover into the core. And of course then, once you finish up your eye, you snug it up the same way as you would with just the thimble. Well, that's it for the last of the eye splices. That gets us one step closer to the launch. Speaking of the launch, there's going to be a commemorative t-shirt for the launching, and that will become available in a couple of weeks. And the best way to stay in touch with when that is to sign up for the newsletter. There will be a link in the description below. So as always, thanks for watching. Remember, if you're going to make it beautiful.